What is logic? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is logic? Logic is the study of correct reasoning. It's extremely important in philosophy because all we're doing basically is thinking and then presenting arguments. And in this case, the thought processes that we're undergoing are internal and they're based on principles of logic. Logic are formal systems of thought that lead us from premises or propositions to conclusions. And in logic, we're studying these processes to find out the accuracy of truth that the process can deliver or what the features of that process can be. Now, we have deductive reasoning in which we set up a thought formula in which the propositions, if the propositions are true, then the conclusions must also be true. And that's an internal formula that is true. In the case of Aristotle, who essentially pioneered it, he had the classic one where he said, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. Without getting into all of the propositions, the truth of the propositions, that's a logically true statement. And the steps from each part of that statement are what we call inferences. When we infer something, it's a step in the reasoning. So when you say Socrates or Aristotle, or all men are mortal, that's one step, right? And then, well, the next step, that's the base, and the step is when you say Aristotle is a man, you're inferring, right? Like that he's a man. He's the logical inference of that is that he is a subset of all men being mortal. And then when you get to the conclusion that he's mortal, now you've reasoned. That's a step from, you said that all men are mortal, and then you've listed a man. And then when you take that final step to the conclusion, you have reasoned that there is a set, and that you have identified Aristotle as one individual in that set of which there are a proposition has been made. And then you've determined that he is a part of it, and that the truth to describe him in relation to the sentence is that he is mortal. And so that's a logically sound argument. Now, when it's internal to your mind and you're thinking it and it's a thought pattern, those are your principles. That's your thought process. And when you articulate it, when you vocalize it or externalize it in some manner, then it becomes an argument. So the thought patterns become the arguments when they're presented. And so the way to have self-analysis on it and to be able to examine the truthfulness of other people's arguments is by examining the logic. So that's deductive reasoning, in which if the propositions are true, the conclusions must also be true. Now, there are many other forms of logic, and we call those ampliative. And in ampliative, they are not self-contained truths in the sentence or in the formulaic structure. They have the ability to account for new information to come into the conclusion. So we have inductive reasoning, which is when we do like statistical analysis. We take a small statistical sample and we say, oh, this, we saw that there were 100 ravens and they were all black. So because of that, because we did this sample study of 100 ravens and they were all black, now we're going to say all ravens are black. Okay. Well, it turns out not to be true because all he needs one albino raven and whatever. But that's inductive reasoning. And then the other type we have is abductive reasoning. And abductive reasoning is when a doctor comes in and says, you're my patient. The propositions are, you're my patient. You have these symptoms. And now I'm going to give you my best guess diagnosis, prognosis for you. But there's also a chance that new information could come to light. It could change, all these different things. So it's not, so it's logically true what he's saying, but it's not definitive. It's not a closed system of thought. Now, in the modern world, it's important because logic is the underpinning for most of our externalized world, mainly computer programming. And when it comes to, they have what they call first order logic, or what they can also call predicate calculus, where they come up with logically correct formulas for thinking, where the propositions and support the conclusions. But what they further go into is they start to put the variables in there. So in a regular sentence, then they will put, instead of saying Aristotle's name, like all men are mortal, Aristotle's a man, instead of saying Aristotle's a man, they'll say X is a man. So they'll say, all men are mortal, X is mortal, X, or all men are mortal, X is a man, therefore X is mortal. And when you combine those two, when you start to take it strictly out of language syntax and you start to put in variables, then you can obviously see how that makes it so that it can start to be used for computer applications or machine thinking, or just essentially like mathematical analysis. And then the logic becomes useful in the language of mathematics and programming. And they further go into really seeing information as sets of information. And computer programming really is at its core about recursive thinking, which means it starts to self-analyze in loops of its own output, applying its own logical formulas to its outputs over and over and over again in this ampliative way to arrive at a conclusion. In their world, that conclusion could be a function, a number, a direction, a calculation, whatever. But that's what their recursive mechanical use of properly logical formulas leads to. And they concern themselves with first order logic and predicate calculus and all these other things. So going back to logic itself, it is the attempt by us to formalize, materialize, and externalize, in some cases, how we process information to arrive at truthful conclusions. That's really the essence of it. And when you look at it from that perspective, it's the key to human thought. And if it's the key to human thought, then it's really the key to why the species is at where it's at in its evolutionary process in relation to the other species. Is this ability to do a repeatable thought process that is logically sound. And through the study of correct reasoning, when we, as the philosopher in this case, look into ourselves, now we understand what the actual self-check system is that we're looking into ourselves is. It's the construction of the way we process the information, which is, the proposition, the beginning of the context of the thing that we want to analyze, and then the steps of reasoning, the inferences, which have different ways to do it, and then getting to the conclusion, and then being able to understand if that conclusion is true or not. And as we go through all of this, it's good to recognize that the language that we're using, we can drill down into any of these things as far as we can, because language is representative of the reality. So really what we're trying to get to is are these parts of language that we're using, because language is an invented thing that we have, and it's representational of the reality that we're trying to express. If we drill deep enough into these propositions and conclusions, are they giving us and are they presenting us the accurate representation of the reality that we're attempting to represent? And that's where the philosopher, you, comes in, is that it's up to the philosopher to divine the essence of the truth of each of these things, of the propositions, of the conclusions, of what the representational language is. That's where the human factor comes in. It's up to us to give the insight into it. Because the language, no matter how much we penetrate into the language is still representative. And this is where the rubber meets the road. Is logic is our tool to investigate and discern and give insight into the truth of the language itself, into the truth of the thought itself, into the true nature of the representation of the thought and the process of what we do with the thought as it continues in us internally, into the representation of the veracity, of the truthfulness of the reality that we're trying to represent, and into the relation that we have with it. And that is a recursive process. That is a loop. That is a thing that that it keeps occurring, and it keeps giving us feedback, and that we need to keep examining. And logic and the systems of logic that we adopt internally end up being our actual relationship with the reality itself. Because if it's true, if we have truthful logic and it's accurate, and we're accepting it as such, and we're doing self-checks, and we know that the feedback loop that we have with the reality is accurate through sound reasoning, which we call logic, and it's verifiable to other people, which is really what philosophy is. When you start to philosophize yourself and you start to espouse your own philosophy, you're really just putting it out there for other people for analysis. And when it comes back that, yes, you have achieved some level of truthful internal process that is the keystone of which is logic, then that gives you the connection to reality to begin to achieve clarity and to begin to achieve all those high-minded notions of enlightenment and self-realization and self-awareness and general interaction with reality, that you can go forward where you've built the trust with the reality. Logic helps us build trust with ourselves, helps us build trust with our thought process, helps us build trust with the reality, helps us build trust with the information exchange that we're having in general terms. And that's why it's been externalized in the Western world into, tech and computers and all those things, and sort of, introduced into the more hybridized with into a mathematical formula so that machines can understand it and the rational side of people can understand it. And there's still plenty of room for the philosophers on the other side, because we need humans to instill the insight and the actual essence of the reality, which is ephemeral. It is ephemeral, and no matter how much we talk it out, the best we can do to validate the reality information that we're taking in is to make sure that our logic is sound. And there are many systems of logic in which to do that, including ones that allow for evolution and growth and new information to come in. So it's not dogmatic in the sense that you come to one logical conclusion and that's it. Although in some cases, things can be logically deduced to be a thing that they are, and that's it, and that's fine. But in terms of concepts and information flowing, logic is not a closed system. Some systems of logic do come to definitive moments about things and information and concepts. But as we talked about with abductive logic or abductive reasoning, logic is not a closed system. Logic, there are systems of logic that allow for growth and evolution and new information to come in. And so you get the best of both. You get the best of both worlds. But logic really is the key to your mind. It's the key to ensuring the authenticity of the information, It's the key to validating the information and existential feedback loop that we have with reality. And it's the ability to move forward with confidence with your intellectual findings about life in a way in which you can present them to other people, and you can translate them into computers and math and really any other discipline. Logic gives you the confidence and the ability to take your intellectual findings and your journey through life and all of this information world that we call life, this holographic existence, and it gives us the ability to validate it as truthful or a high degree of validity, and then with confidence in whatever discipline or area of life that we're living, be able to speak, translate, or put into our life, occupation, or personal interactions with other people, and can increase our confidence and give us our ability to evolve and have confidence in our independent ability to think and eventually exercise our free will. It informs our discipline, relationship, and ability, and our agency to have independent intellectual, spiritual, physical sovereignty in this world. And in that way, it's pretty important. So, what is logic? It's a key to our human mind. As always, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found it helpful. And as always, have fun.